I'm Adam Callaway. I'm here with Dr. Jonathan Griffiths, and today we're talking about sermon introductions. And Jonathan, just wondering if you have some thoughts about introducing sermons well.
Well, I have some thoughts about it. I think each sermon is different, right? Each sermon is its own thing. So I'd be wary about saying there's an absolute rule about how to do introductions. But it's worth, I think, contemplating what it is you're trying to achieve with an introduction. And I think there are a number of things going on at the beginning of a sermon, some of them more significant than others. But on a most basic level, especially if you're not the regular preacher for a congregation or if you're speaking in an environment where people don't know you so well, one of the things you're wanting to do at the beginning of a sermon is partly just to get people used to listening to your voice, to sort of ease them into hearing you and to engaging with what you're going to bring them from the Word of God, which is going to be very, very significant. And right at the beginning, there may be a few minutes involved of just allowing people to tune in, and it's worth being mindful of that, especially if you're speaking in a context that's not your normal context. I think the other thing is as well, just in general, when you're speaking to any group of people, even if they're a very familiar group, it often takes them a moment or two just to get their minds focused on listening and listening well. And so for that reason, I'm sometimes a little bit cautious about diving straight in to deep exegesis in a text, straight into some of the substance of some of the theology I want to draw out. You want to give people a moment or two just to kind of acclimatize and get ready to listen well. So that's one thing that's going on in a sermon introduction, and it's worth just being aware of that. It's a kind of practical consideration, but I think it's a real one, and worth being mindful of it. But then in terms of thinking, okay, what substance is useful in the context of an introduction to use to introduce? What are some strategies for introducing well? I think that can really vary from sermon to sermon, but I think it's very, very helpful if you are able in the introduction of a sermon to bring people into what you understand to be the core issue of the text, the core lesson of the text. And if you can engage people on that thematically, find an introduction that will open up the key theme of the text, that's a really wonderful thing. And if in that time you're not only getting people used to listening to your voice and used to listening in general and sort of quietening down and focusing their minds, but then if you can draw them into the central issue of the text, that's a very, very good use of time and very, very helpful. You won't always find an introduction that gets them to the core issue of the text. You might find that you introduce an issue of the text, maybe tied to your first point of the sermon. That can be something. But the more central, the more core it can be, that's helpful. That's kind of an intellectual level. If you can get people intellectually on the same plane as the text and where you're going in terms of the exposition, that's a great thing. Sometimes you can engage people not only at the level of an understanding of the theme, but you can engage their heart, and you can convince people that listening for the next 20 minutes or 30 minutes or 40 minutes, whatever it is going to do them spiritual good. There is something here that really matters, not just on an intellectual level, but on a heart level. And if you can get the listener really to feel and understand, because you believe that what the Bible is saying is important, what God has to say through his word is vitally important. You believe this as the preacher. And if you can demonstrate in some way to your hearers, if you can impress upon them the idea that missing out on this will be a tremendous loss to them in some way. If you can do that in the introduction, that's wonderful. I think realistically, probably one doesn't achieve that every time. And so having some variety of substance and intensity and tactic is good. I think if you go in and try and do the same thing, operating on the kind of the same level each time, that becomes quite predictable for people. So those are a few factors I've kind of got in mind when I think about sermon introductions.
That's great. So introducing a need, sort of welcoming people into what you're saying without becoming predictable.
I think so.
Yeah, really helpful. Thanks, Jonathan.